second meeting of the WebTools working group, and we will figure out what it is we are doing today. I see we've got a pretty similar group of people today, but not exactly the same. I'm not sure if we want to go through intros or if we just want to jump right into content. Anyone have an opinion?
Content.
Okay. Yeah, I'll share my screen then. And yeah, hit this one.
I can say a quick hi, Adrian from Foxglove here. I came across your discourse thread and watched the last one. Sorry, we didn't catch that in time, but it was nice to see the recording. I see a few familiar faces here. Hey, Christian.
Yeah, I'm glad you're here. You came up in the meeting as you saw in the recording, and I'm interested to get to know the product a little bit. It's not something I'm familiar with, so yeah, glad you're here.
Yeah, it's a great initiative. We're happy to help in any way we can.
We'll see. This still being an early idea, we'll see if we can make it useful for all of us. Still trying to feel that out exactly where we get our value from here. So let's see. We've got this meeting, which is not in June. And the agenda we have is high-level roadmap. Yep. And maintainership. We'll want to use GitHub Teams for that. I don't know if we'll want to do that live. Maybe we can do some of that housekeeping live. But something I'll ask folks to do is just add yourself to the attendance list. If you are so inclined, and just using that as a way to kind of see, who shows up over time, get a sense of how many people are interested in this. Then in terms of, we had a lot of notes from last time, and we have now succeeded at the action item of reaching out to Foxglove, and I'll join the Slack. In terms of call for interest for presenters, I think we'll do that for next time. This time, I think we'll probably pay attention to the action items we have going on. Yeah, so no presentation today. Though, yeah, unless Adrian, you had any sort of off-the-cuff a bit of Foxglove you could show. Don't want to put you on the spot though if you're not ready for that.
Yeah,
today.
we can. I'm happy to do off-the-cuff if people are interested.
Yeah, I mean, I personally am. We could take 10 minutes on that.
Something else that might be nice to throw on the agenda. I think you talked a bit about it at the last one, but just sort of understanding like what is the charter for this group and like what do other folks want to get out of it? Yep. Is it just about kind of maintaining the stuff under the ROS WebTools org, or is it are there other things people want to get out, coordination and things? Also, something we were kind of curious about is like it's called WebTools, but it sort of breaks into the Node.js ecosystem as well. Like JavaScript is used server side and things, so we're kind of curious about like the scope of the meeting.
Yeah, when I say web development, I do consider the backend portion as well. So like JavaScript falls into that ecosystem, I guess, as opposed to what I would call like device side native apps. Although JavaScript, you're running it natively. Yeah, it's it can turn into splitting hairs there, but yeah, we're not going to be working on RViz here.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we do have a first draft of the charter open, and I had wanted to get to some of the action items we had on that. I'll post that in the chat here. So we've got this community repository, which is meant to be the governance model and a list of the projects and the charter. And we've got a first draft there. I'll admit I just moved house since the last meeting, and so I have gotten basically nothing done in terms of this stuff. So I haven't gotten a chance to look at that. But we have some ideas about solidifying the list, at least, of things that go in here. And if we want to refine the language in there, this is really just a first draft. It's not set in stone, and we can keep writing it as we go. So this, I think, is a good place to try and define what we want this working group to be about. And that could be a sort of collective understanding that we gain over time. But yeah, we say WebTools. I'm including the Node.js client largely because I think it is a critical portion of the bridge to a browser. Because I'm not saying browser tools, right? And in order to do, say, the ROS2 ROS bridge protocol, you're using the Node.js client in order to connect into the ROS system. So I consider that part of the ecosystem. But that basically gets us through. I like having these agendas just because it gives you a checklist of things to go through. But that is the only community PR to look at right now. And we already took a look at that last time. So what I'd like to do shortly after this meeting is address that. Any of the comments we have on there, and then just merge it after we've maybe taken care of. I'm actually inclined, someone let me know if you have a different idea. I'm inclined to merge it as is with all of the existing repositories, and then we can clean out some of the older ones that aren't used anymore as follow-up steps. So everyone think about that. Probably doesn't matter either way.
Do you, yeah, I mean, it's possible to edit it after. It's almost easier to iterate on it after it's merged, because then you can just make PRs and discuss individual things.
Exactly.
Is there a point in listing all of the repos? I mean, would it be easier to just link to GitHub? The list might change over time.
Yeah, so the point that I was trying to make with these, and this is sort of forked from the working group governance template that we put together with Open Robotics TSC. The idea is that you have a strong understanding of what you're promising to maintain as a working group, and so the organization may or may not get gain and lose repositories, but you want to have some sort of place where you discussed whether you actually want to take that on as this entity that we're trying to create. I don't know how much value that adds, but at the very least, it sort of says, we discussed this, we decided we were going to maintain it, rather than someone created a repository and now it exists there, was the idea.
Would it make sense to only list things for which we have actually identified a point person?
I think that is, yeah, probably that would make sense. So actually, yeah, maybe we want to talk about maintainers first, and then, well, I'd like to get that just first draft of the charter in. It can list everything that's in there right now, and we could remove things that we decide don't have a maintainer. So I don't know if anyone wants to toss an approval on this, given that it's, nothing's final and it really doesn't make any strong promises in terms of anyone's time commitment here. I guess I'm not even requiring approvals. Do I have any objection to merging this and then moving from here as a starting point? Okay, we're gonna do it. So what we can do now is...
Yeah. What do you mean by the merging? Like the ROS-lib.js together with our ROS2D.js and ROS3D.js, or is it?
No, sorry, I just meant merging the pull request that adds the first draft of the charter. So now the README says something that's not a template.
Okay,
Yeah.
clear.
So this is a good place if we want to discuss, what the scope of this working group is and what has maintainers, etc. This feels like a good place to write that down and have it just on paper or on bits. So we can move on. That's housekeeping. And then, Adrian, would you want to show us a little bit about Foxglove? I'm sure most of us are curious.
Yeah, definitely. I can present, and then I guess feel free to interject with questions or put them in the chat or whatever people feel comfortable with.
Yeah, thank you.
So a bit of background. I spent the last 5 years at Cruise, leading dev tools and infrastructure there. We built a lot of web-based tooling pretty early on, right from sort of back in 2016. We invested in the web stack. Cruise was a ROS shop early on too. I mean, over time they've replaced quite a lot of ROS, and it sort of has become more of their own thing now. But certainly, like, there's a lot of sort of ROS concepts still there. As part of that work at Cruise, one of my teams built Webverse, and that came out of a hackathon. I think sort of started back in maybe 2017. And so I'm kind of assuming folks are familiar with Webverse, but I'll sort of speak to both and how that kind of relates to Foxglove. So Webverse is an awesome project. I love it. About half of the Webverse code is open source and the other half is closed source, and the two are very tightly intertwined. So it's quite difficult to sort of contribute to Webverse, and it's quite difficult to extend. And I'm not saying this in a bad way. Cruise has their own set of priorities, and they're focused on getting a self-driving car on the road. But there's a lot of things that I think the community has wanted in Webverse for some time, like extensions and ROS2 support and some of these things that Cruise doesn't have time to work on and doesn't really, has no real need to work on for themselves. So the goal with Foxglove is basically, you can see it as the evolution of Webverse. We're a separate company now. We have about 7 people at the moment. A lot of folks from the Webverse team, plus a few other folks from Cruise and other companies. I think there's probably 4 people on the call today: Roman, John, Esther, and myself. I'll give a quick demo. We forked from Webverse back in sort of early February. So the last 4 or 5 months, we've done quite a bit of changes. We've added new panels. I can just sort of demonstrate a little bit. We are primarily shipping an Electron app at the moment. So we still have a web build in our repo, and we'll probably get around to publishing that at some point. But Electron gives us a few advantages. One is that we can have access to native APIs, so we can do things like we support native ROS1 connections now, which is talks directly to the ROS master over TCP, which you can't do from a browser. And other, just things like that we have access to. It's also a lot easier when we can control the browser version. We're not having to worry about like tons of different browser support at this point in time. And there's some features of Chrome. Even Webverse only works in Chrome. We also ported.
So is it purely Electron native app, or is there a browser compatibility also?
There's browser compatibility. So there's a web build in our repo.
That's what you're saying.
That runs through CI and everything. Just we haven't published that on the internet.
Okay.
But you can check out the repo and build the web version of it. And our CI does that. So it's there. It's just not something that we're pushing right now. But cool. I'm kind of curious to hear from people. Some people show up and they want a browser version for one reason or another. Something people have specifically asked for is a browser version so that they can access it on an iPad. But that's more than just publishing a browser version. That would actually require us to add WebKit or Safari support. Anyway, just some things like that. It does, it supports live connections and WebSocket connections. Like I said, we can do ROS bridge connections. We can do ROS1 native connections. ROS2 is kind of in progress at the moment. John's working on that. We have a bunch of sort of work that's come out of that, some feedback that we might try and feed into the rosbag project and some things like that. When you load, I guess, some of the changes, I don't know how familiar people are with Webverse, but we've added a bunch of new panels. We have layout management now, so you can create layouts. You can create a new layout that's empty, and then you can add panels. So the 3D panel is sort of the thing that people will be most familiar with as being kind of similar to others. And let's see. So I'll just start that playing. You can turn on and off different topics. something else we added was support for just decoding this. So this bag file actually is out of the Udacity data set. So that's just like an open source data set that's available online. Let's see. Yeah, we added support for just decoding like Velodyne scan, for example. Like we also support point cloud too, but we added support for just decoding Velodyne scan directly as well, in case people find that helpful. There's different. You can have different transforms if this bag's relatively simple, so there's not a ton in there. You have like images. You can put on and off like different images. You can split panels. You can set up like left camera, right camera. We support like 3D markers and image markers as well. What else? Plots. Topic graph is interesting, although it doesn't work with a bag file. But I think I heard you guys talking about topic graph, sort of like RQT graph.
Yeah,
A little bit. And then, yeah, let's see, you can like plot arbitrary data. Raw messages is quite interesting. You can just like get, any sort of, any data out of it. So this is all built with the web stack. We, I guess, also as part of that have written it's all open source. We've written quite a few libraries too, as kind of part of this work. So all of that's kind of public on our GitHub as well. There's stuff for interacting with ROS messages and ROS bags. And there's a ROS1 kind of implementation, which sort of overlaps conceptually a bit with, and I always mix up like ROS Node.js and RCL Node.js, and there's a third one too. But we have our own one, which we needed to make it work with Electron because we needed to have like pluggable transport layers so that we can do some clever stuff to feed the data through Electron's like various layers of security. Yeah, the other thing that's sort of interesting, I won't. This like takes quite a while to explore, but so there's a thing called Node Playground, which this concept needs a bit of iteration. But essentially, you can write inline in TypeScript here, sort of, and we have like autocomplete and everything. But you can write like the equivalent of a ROS node. So I think it was IMU data, wasn't it? You can, yeah, you can sort of like actually write inline here something that would run. And have a look at some incoming ROS messages and, for example, like publish markers or something like that. So it's sort of like a way that you can write like live transforms. Yeah, that's kind of interesting. What else? We added support for UIDFs. Yeah, there's a bunch of stuff on our roadmap, but happy to answer any questions. That's probably like the main overview. Oh yeah, and extensions, I should have mentioned. So that was one of the main kind of feature requests that existed in Webverse pretty much since it was like first announced was, how do you extend it? And right now with Webverse, the answer to extending it is basically like you take the code base and fork it, and then, hope that you're able to like rebase your changes over time, which is pretty annoying. We believe in making this like very extensible. And so we've just actually launched like an extension API where you can create panels and publish them. And we have, kind of a sort of like an extension store kind of thing. This is like the first version of it here. So kind of taking some ideas from VS Code, I guess, where you can sort of have the base editor, and this is going to give you a basic set of panels and all the layout management and the data management connections and things like that. And then, but you can very easily kind of take it and make it your own, build your own extensions and either publish them or keep them private. But, your extensions can live in a separate repo and you don't have to, try and rebase changes on top of the open source project.
Fantastic.
Super awesome.
Yeah, so with the extensions, that's one of the big selling points for like RViz, right? Is I feel most of the times that I've used RViz, it's been with some custom set of extensions to make a specific workflow, right? So that's really nice.
Yeah. Publish panel. Our publishing support's pretty limited at the moment, but all of the kind of plumbing is there, so you can also make an extension to sort of like control your robot if you want as well.
Oh yeah, how are the topics defined in, or the, sorry, not the topics, the message types defined into this application?
So that's an interesting question. With ROS1 and with Rosbag 1, we have access to the message definitions. So and Rosbag 1, the message definitions are in the bag file, so that makes it nice and easy to read. And with Rosbridge, I think maybe John or Roman can speak more competently to this, but I think the same thing was true of Rosbridge, and the same thing was true with the ROS1 native connection. However, that is kind of one of our sticking points with ROS2, is that the Rosbags don't have the definitions. I think the ROS2 native connection also doesn't give us a way to acquire the definitions without having them locally.
Yeah, there's not. Oh, go ahead.
Do you want to talk, John?
Oh, I was just going to say, yes, that's what I've been seeing. We lost all of the introspection and also all the checksumming as well. So even if you have a message definition, you don't know if a value had changed between an int32 and a float32. It's going to silently decode the same. If that bag format had changed before or after you had published it.
Yeah, so that's interesting, and I think that's something we're hearing in multiple. So I'm one of the primary maintainers of Rosbach 2 right now, so this is a good place to start this conversation. I've got another working group that is on the Fridays. It's tomorrow, the ROS tooling working group, where we mostly discuss Rosbag. So if you want to join us there and talk about any of these features, there's absolutely no disagreement that we need these sorts of introspection capabilities, but we just haven't had the development resources to design it out properly yet and build it. So that's one of the things that we want to build in for Humble, which is coming out next May. I'm personally thinking about Humble Hawksbill as ROS2 1.0. I think everything up to this has been like a real solid beta. And so like collecting these final needs before, what's stopping us from using ROS2 effectively and addressing all of those within the next 11 months, I think is really important. So anyways, it's good to hear that input, and I think we should continue that conversation, whether on GitHub or in the working group. I'm happy to help at least.
I think John opened a GitHub issue about this, I think, too, right?
Perfect.
Yeah, I wanted to start that. I think we need to start that same conversation with the wherever we discuss connecting directly to ROS2 live systems as well. It has the same issue.
Yeah. So I think it comes down to maybe building some core tooling in ROS2 that then we can expose through Rosbag and come up with a cohesive solution for the whole thing. Totally agree.
Yeah, and part of that also just comes out of like the difference in, when you're building things in C++ or in Python, you typically have the code base and you have the message definitions and all of these things. But when you're sort of building web tools, you don't typically have all of the code base around all the message definitions, and we could add support for that. It's kind of janky if we have to get you to link your GitHub account and then make assumptions about which version of the message is mapped to which bag or
but
things
even
like
then,
that. But it's just
even then, people take bags from data sets and want to play them back, even if they didn't have the code base that originally created them. No, I think regardless of the web use case, people need these sort of more generic introspection capabilities. It's a universal need.
Totally.
The other set of challenges I'm running into myself is around the use of SQLite versus a more flat binary file. So in WebViz and now in Foxglove, one of the nice features that was developed early on is the ability to drag and drop a bag file into a web browser, and you can start playing back and seeing it. Supporting that is challenging in Rosbach 2. Using SQL, I don't know if there were other developments of people doing this yet, where you can have a full browser-based decoder for Rosbach 2. If so, I'd love to see the links, but I'm working on my own over here. And yeah, it looks like I'm mostly sequestered to using the SQL.js WASM build. If I want it to run purely in a browser, I'm making it pluggable. And so you can use a native connector if you're on a Node.js or you're on Electron. But for the pure browser use case, it looks like we're going to have to decode the entire DB3 file into a byte array, pass it into WASM, and then deal with a number of limitations that are in there beyond the memory limits, like no support for big int in that build, and a couple other things that are just kind of putting upper limits on what you can actually do with a Rosbag 2 versus a Rosbag 1 in a browser environment.
Yeah. So I have a lot of thoughts about this. I don't want to like derail the entire meeting onto talking about Rosbag in the WebTools,
totally,
but I would, maybe we need to have like a little breakout meeting to, because there's no hard requirement on it being SQLite 3 based. Like the storage implementation is a plugin in Rosbag 2, and we're even working on a way to easily convert between, different storage backends. There aren't a lot of other ones out there yet, but there could be, and we could potentially add a conversion tool that would easily make it, into a much more web consumable version. So I'd like to have that conversation. I think there are a few different ways we can tackle this problem, and it's good to see those real use cases coming into play.
Yeah, we can do that in the Friday meeting or whenever it works. We don't need to derail this conversation too much.
Yeah, if you want to come to the tooling working group, that'd be the perfect place to spend an hour talking about it.
Great,
yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, there was one question you brought up near the beginning when you were showing about why do people want a browser build, and I wanted to just feed in a little bit of my personal thought on that, which is that I've worked on these robotics projects with ROS where you have non-developers who are either operating or testing your robot. So you've maybe got a QA team, or you've got an operations team who's moving the robot around. And these viz tools like RViz or WebViz or Foxglove are really strong interfaces for dealing with that robotics data and seeing what's happening and interacting with it. And what we found is that our QA folks, our operations folks, it was hard to get them set up with a developer workstation that had the ROS2 code and an installation of ROS. And on ROS1 it had to be Ubuntu instead of their whatever Windows or their Chromebook or whatever. And having a purely web-based interface is a great way to build an operational or testing workflow around a robot when you're talking about the non-developer persona within the company.
Yeah.
So for me, that's the strong use case I see for a non-native app.
Yeah, I want to second that. I have been asking Adrian about exactly what that same motivation. At Savvyog, I was the VP of software at Savvyog, and our biggest concern there was operational efficiency. And so my team was 60% of our time was spent on building tools for our ops folks, just the persona that you just described, Emerson. So
yeah,
anything that you can give them. So I was actually going to ask, you currently have this concept of extensions, and that's really awesome that you can add custom panels. Have you also thought of the orthogonal of that, where you would allow those panels that you currently have to be sort of breaking out and embedded into an existing web application?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You know where I'm coming from, right? This is sort of the approach that I'm taking with Transitive right now. But I think it would be really powerful, because then you could let, say like a Fetch Robotics take some of your panels and embed it in their own operational tools, which I think they would love.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. People have asked for that. It's probably something that we want to support long term. I guess the things that we need to take into account are, there's a lot of code in the Foxglove code base. There's several years of development of a full team of people that have gone into it, and we don't want to make all of that sort of a stable API. If we flip that switch and people start building on top of it, then they're going to expect us to be not, shuffling and refactoring things super heavily over time. So I don't know. We're definitely open to the idea. It could be possible that there's some way to sort of instantiate a version of Foxglove where you can just sort of, it's kind of like, an embedded Google Maps panel or something, right? Where you just like have a one-liner that boots it up with a fixed layout with one panel open and a specific data source connection or something like that. Totally could be possible. It's work that would need to happen just to figure out like what that API is. And then, because we're sort of like committing to maintaining that over time. But yeah, it's definitely a use case that I can see value in. And that's, a lot of the point of it being open source too, is that people can kind of like just remix it and use for various things like this. Yeah, and I guess Roman's kind of point in chat there too is there's two ways you could think about that. One would be just like, can I just import the panel or even libraries that create the panel and sort of build my own thing from it. The other one is, can I just kind of like boot up Foxglove, in like a iframe or a React component or something that's running with kind of the whole app with the, because depends if you want like data connectors and things like that. Like, are you going to pass the data into it manually, or do you want to, do you want the Foxglove component to handle getting the data from ROS bridge or whatever it is?
So one last question I had is there a closed source portion, or is the entire Foxglove Studio open source?
Everything right now is open source. So where we intend to add paid features is around anything that talks to a backend. So we're doing a bunch of planning now around kind of the ability to log into a team and have like shared layouts and shared views and things like that. So again, that's something that was really useful and powerful at Cruise, and we and Cruise never open sourced that part because the whole backend is, that's tied into a bunch of other Cruise things that it wouldn't be possible to open source. But there's the ability to kind of log in and like collaborate more with a team, and anything that's kind of talking to that backend would probably be part of a paid plan. The tool itself and anything that you can kind of do individually on your computer would be, it's always going to remain open source.
Nice. Yeah, great.
Yeah.
Okay, does anyone else have any other questions about Foxglove for now? Otherwise, I was thinking we'd move on to discussing, what did we have next? The high-level roadmap for what we want to, or at least what we want out of roadmap. Yeah, thank you so much for that presentation. Really cool. I'm happy you saw our thread and came today.
Yeah, that worked well. Yeah, and we'd love to collaborate too if anyone wants to check it out or make PRs. And also, as we kind of get into talking about the robot WebTools libraries, it could be interesting to talk about whether there's overlaps or gaps. Or certainly, I already trip over myself keeping track of the various like ROS JavaScript implementations. So
yeah, I mean, so
we don't have to solve everything on day one, but it's definitely like something we can put on the long-term roadmap.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, I think there's definitely a possibility for taking some of the common, I don't want to say non-interesting, but sort of non-business critical portions and turning them into generic components, seeing where that goes. Yeah, anyways, possibility for collaboration, definitely.
And I also wanted to say hi to John Herleman. He and I worked together in our virtual world phase of our many years ago.
Yeah, different planning communities, different decade. It's good to see you.
Cool. Getting people back together. Let's talk about the roadmap. And I think high level, the question is, what roadmaps do we want to put together for this working group? I think we have a general idea of the set of libraries we want to be working on, at least to start out with, set of projects, which is basically JavaScript clients and Rosbach protocol and maybe a couple of individual components. But it's mostly this infrastructural stuff, right? Like clients and protocol for communication seems to me to be the core of the charter here. And do we want to put together a high-level roadmap for ROS1, or are we putting that into maintenance mode, given that Noetic is out and there's not going to be another ROS1 distro? I guess that's a first question. Personally, I'm focused entirely on ROS 2, but I want to make sure that I'm being inclusive of everyone's needs and not just putting my priorities onto this.
Are you asking specifically for ROS 1? Are you asking specifically about like Rosbridge and things like that?
Yeah, these, and I guess any JavaScript clients that we're trying to promise to maintain as a group. It's, do we need a roadmap for these things, or is it fix bugs as they come up and that's about it? Yeah, the question is, how much effort should we be spending on ROS 1 right now versus looking forward to ROS 2?
I think, hi, this is Roman, another Foxglove person. I think that finding a path for ROS, what we call the ROS message serialization, and rosbag libraries for ROS 1 to gain more prominence, whether under robot web tools or somehow, would be useful. Some of the genesis for kind of why rosbag.js even exists, I was the first author of it back in Cruise, and we didn't find amongst the existing JS tooling at the time ways to work with, quote, bag files and just messages themselves. We had a few use cases like that. And so something kind of separated from that. I think that is a thing that people using ROS 1 will still benefit from, and providing that.
That makes sense to me. And so these are components that you, let's see, I'm looking at ROS message serialization library, but I see initial commit 2 days ago. So
yeah, so to some backstory, Rosbach, so the first things that when we started to foray into web tools, into browser-based and JavaScript-based tooling at Cruise, both Node.js and client side, one of the first projects that we were involved in was, what could we do with bag files? And so a lot of our thinking evolved from the rosbag.js package, but what went into making that package that we didn't really find at the time were pure kind of idiomatic JavaScript ecosystem libraries for doing the ROS message parsing of the definitions, then deserializing off of those definitions. So those were like the first building blocks we actually put together. And I know that there is in Gen message, there are some JavaScript message generators, but they were not consumable, certainly at the time, as like published NPM modules or even as JavaScript. I think those might have been actually written in Python. It's been a while since I've looked. And so that was like a kind of hurdle, and that's why the native JS parsing and serialization, deserialization was written kind of into rosbag.js. So the lineage has to trace to rosbag.js, kind of how we got there. We've been working on separating out because we believe those pieces are independently reusable, but that's kind of some of the backstory around that and why kind of even rosbag.js exists with those pieces. If you look at Cruise's version, you'll see more history there. That's like the version that we originally iterated on that got published.
I see. Yeah.
Yeah, it's worth pointing out. I just put a link in the chat, but we have a bunch of sort of incubation packages in our Foxglove Studio repo, and we're in the process of like extracting those into separate repos and separate NPM modules. So that's why the ROS message serialization one that you found on GitHub has a commit from 2 days ago. But the actual code is in the Studio repo.
I see. Okay, I'm trying to pull it out. That makes sense. And so
yeah,
the thought
I guess
is,
there's like several layers. There's one library that handles decoding and encoding of message definitions. There's one library that handles serializing and deserializing the messages themselves, and there's one library that handles serializing and deserializing bag files.
Mm-hmm. Okay,
Yeah,
so the thought is,
sorry to interject. The person we're missing here today is Chris, forget his last name right now, Chris Smith from formerly Rethink Robotics. He's now at Ready Robotics. He's the main author of ROS Node.js. There's two serialization, deserialization methods there. One actually was originally written by Brandon Alexander, who's at Ironox now, and I took that over and merged it into ROS Node.js. But I think Roman, I think you and Chris, I should connect the two of you if you haven't spoken yet, because I think it would be really good to sort of get your heads together and think about perhaps the four of us with Adrian also to think about how to maintain that going forward. I think that the community would really benefit from us merging efforts there, because I've taken a look at what you've done, and John was also kind enough to elaborate a little bit on the differences on ROS discourse. I think that would be a real that would be an accomplishment if we could merge efforts there.
Right. So in terms of to tie this back, like in terms of a ROS1 roadmap, maybe it is consolidating these efforts and getting there to be one solid way to deal with messages and bags and serialization for web tools. That makes sense.
Quick question: is the scope of this working group one-to-one with the Robot Web Tools GitHub organization? And if so, and I guess like, does the ROS Node.js, I think that's under a different org or person or something, like, is the intention to bring that into this group and or this GitHub org, or are they separate things?
They're currently separate, and I haven't talked to Chris about his interest in putting it under the purview of this repo. To me, it's all semantics. Like it doesn't really matter which repo it is under. But I do think one way or another, Chris belongs into this working group, and we should talk. Where we maintain it is sort of probably irrelevant.
Yeah, we're using the Robot Web Tools organization. There's no strong requirement for things to be mapped one-to-one. At the end of the day, it kind of comes down to whoever shows up here and wants to work on stuff, wherever that stuff they want to work on is. Because we're not anyone's boss. We're just bringing people together who are working on a common set of things.
And I guess more than a roadmap, having the people together talking is really the thing that's going to work here.
I think that the roadmap is interesting from the perspective of communicating to the community what the priorities are and trying to bring people together to collaborate on some of these efforts. So if we say, we as a working group, and there's, over a dozen people here, say, these are the most important things, it's possible we can bring in other efforts as well. Anyone who's looking for some way to contribute, or I think the value we can provide is, yes, getting people in the same room, which already we've had a few, I think, serendipitous conversations that will unblock future development, and then trying to an extent, steer some of these projects, or at least communicate their importance. That's I guess that was a long way of saying I agree. So what I want to do also is I would like to try and have a roadmap for ROS2 Humble, and that way we can try to decide as a group what we think are the blockers for usability for ROS2 right now. That's the way I'm trying to think about it, is like, what is the gap? What is the experience we have in ROS1 that we're still missing in ROS2? And or what are we missing in both of them that is just making it hard to use web tools in general? And those are the things I'd like to highlight and try and bring resources to bear on. I don't have that list on the top of my head, but.
I guess a related question, sorry if like all of my questions ends up being like meta questions rather than actually the content, but
it's early conversations.
Yeah, I mean, it's only the second meeting. I would imagine that most stuff in like JavaScript and web land is going to be sort of relatively independent of the versioning of ROS releases. So I would assume, so that's like statement one, feel free to push back on it. So if that is true, then most of our concerns that relate to like the timing of ROS releases are probably going to be things more about like, like John's point, like, can we get some work into ROS2H or whatever it is, to, allow ROS to give us some way to receive the message definitions or stuff like that. Like, is that an accurate statement, or are you thinking that we might align releases of like JavaScript libraries around ROS releases too?
So I think that there is a boundary there where the sync stops to make sense. So I think that RCL Node.js, so the ROS2 client library runs on the native side, I think that you'll want to pair with the distro because it matches up with the native APIs. But then you've got the other side of it, the JavaScript, or sorry, the browser JavaScript side client that probably you want to keep a really stable API between those two, the server and browser side. Such that the browser ecosystem can evolve independently. So I think it makes sense for the Node.js client to have a roadmap tied to the distro, and I think it makes sense for us to think about what core tooling we need on the native side to help us build the more generic and cross-distro capable functionality we need. Because right now I think that doing things across distros is difficult, and some of that just has to do with the maturity and stability of ROS2 as a project.
Something I'll add to that, talking about like the Node client and just, again, we have obviously going back to Crew's extensive experience with like the Catkin, the workspaces, and how you interface with ROS on the system versus not, is the differences between what I'll call a hard to give the terminology, but I'll call it a native implementation. And that's just like a pure JavaScript or TypeScript implementation versus, I believe, the case today for like RCL, Node.js or whatnot, where it uses bindings. And that is also a limiting factor in some cases. Maybe if there's WASM, that's a different thing. But the bindings versus non-bindings, like whether you have machine code tied to a specific architecture that is tied to your package, is a big kind of differentiator.
So I want to respond to that a little bit. Is that there's an intentional choice in ROS2 to create a common core that was compatible with basically every machine you could possibly want to run it on, which is why RCL, the ROS client library core, is written in C rather than even C++. And you've got then your various language-specific client libraries, RCL Pi, RCL CPP, RCL Node.js, Rust, Go, Java, and all of these are built on bindings around the C core. And the idea is that you don't have to rebuild ROS from scratch every time you want to get a new language. So there is, I would consider it an advantage that the Node.js client doesn't have to be a very big code base. There still, ends up being a decent amount of stuff you have to build to make the bindings feel like an idiomatic, client for that language. But I do see your point where sometimes you want, pure JavaScript capabilities, but
just going back to the drag and drop Rosbag 2 into the browser and go from there, that use case.
Yeah. In that case, yeah.
Is that feasible, John or Roman? I guess with if RCL is written in C.
So
I don't know how practical is it. Is it going to be to compile that into something that you can actually run in the browser? I
will say that, and there's a lot of different takes on this, and that is one approach, and I have seen projects take that approach. The comments I'll add to that is that, one, it's feasible if we have a way to build that into WASM and there's a sensible path there, then yeah, you can theoretically reuse the C pieces and have a WASM build and then do bindings on that. The other thing I'll say is that there are sometimes, and not always, advantages to having the kind of native implementation because things feel more idiomatic, and there's, like, when you go to debug things, it's a kind of a clearer path of, oh, you're not kind of then hopping into another kind of black box system. So there are ways forward to use the kind of RCL C library if we go the WASM route, but it also does mean that you're limited by certain things around what the WASM compilation layer will expose to you, whether around reading files, usually around I/O things is where it starts to get a little tricky, less around just CPU-bound computation and algorithms. So nothing is not doable, but that's kind of my take on where the bridge between wanting to implement something quote unquote native or idiomatic to the language and the system can be met with, challenges either way. Yeah.
Yeah, to jump back, like the Rosbach use case is different. Like I was thinking about the native transport use case, and in Rosbach too, we try to make a distinction between the bag functionality and the transport layer that actually talks to ROS2 and has communications there. One of the interesting things is given that the middleware implementation is a generic API and can be under the hood. You've got DDS by default, but there are other options. That's why it's nice to have the RCL as a common core to that, because it's going to be hard for us to, we can't necessarily expect that a ROS system is running DDS and then grab that particular serialization format and communication protocol in the browser. But in terms of the Rosbag itself, we try to keep that separated, and it might make sense to have parsing libraries. A difficulty comes in again that we theoretically support different formats of ROSbags. So even if you've got a bag that's a SQLite 3 database, there could be another one that's based on LevelDB, or another one that's based on. Sony built a LevelDB implementation of the storage backend, and since it's plugin based, that's easy to do. You can just ignore the SQL implementation, but we could have other formats, and so that's why the plugin-based nature of these tools makes these conversations a little bit more complicated.
Yeah, I have some more questions that I think would be probably best for the Rosbag working group to go deeper into that.
Yeah, totally. Sorry, getting derailed. I'm just thinking about.
No, there's definitely a lot of overlap, and how all these pieces can talk together, because I think decisions made in one area do affect the JavaScript tooling ecosystem, right? And possibly vice versa.
Which is why I like trying to get more of these working groups going. It just helps with the cross-pollination of ideas. We've got a few out there that are a little bit less application focused, but are super useful too. Like, you got the navigation group, the control working group are two that are actually actively building products. There are a few others that are more just discussion forums that I haven't seen as much output from, but yeah.
Something that is probably worth noting on the thought about, how ROS2 is a lot more pluggable and modular, actually presents more of a challenge, I think, for us working in the web tools than anything.
It does.
Because, like where in ROS1, it was usually just, implementing one. We're not building a robot, right? And so it's not, everyone building a robot can just pick an implementation and move on with their life. For us building tools that interact with that, now we have to deal with the kind of product of every possible combination of these various plugins that people are using. So yeah, I don't know what the solution is there, but it's just something to note, and something that we've kind of noticed as we try to add ROS2 support is that even when thinking about Rosbag, it's it's nice that it's pluggable and there's a LevelDB plugin, but the defaults are really important to us because that's mostly what people are going to show up with. And to the extent people are using different plugins, that actually just makes life harder for us. I don't know if other people building web stuff have noticed that. It's probably less of an issue if you're building tools internally for a company, because you're still only dealing with one set of choices. But if you're trying to build generic tools for the ROS ecosystem, it's it makes life rather difficult.
Yeah, that's a good point, Roman, in terms of learning. And I think that goes back to what you said there, Adrian, where the defaults are important, and picking a really solid set of defaults is just a key part of building these things. Yeah, so I feel like we still have a ton to talk about, but we're reaching the end of our hour. How did everyone feel about this day and time? I'd like to get a recurring meeting on the calendar rather than having to do a doodle for each one. Yeah, anyone think this time was not very good? The last one we didn't like. This one I like better. Okay,
Yeah,
I'm gonna.
this is good.
Yeah, I'll schedule another one 2 weeks from now, same time, same day. And if we like the 2-week cadence, then we'll stay with that. If we decide to go to once a month at some point, we'll see about that. At the moment, we're still early in the conversation, have a ton to talk about, so I think 2 weeks is good. So I will say yes, 2 weeks. Okay. I'm not sharing my screen anymore, but I was just writing notes. If anyone has any notes from the meeting, please feel free to dump them in here. I basically just hit OK on edits. So feel free to take notes during the meeting or afterwards. And I will put the next meeting's block there, so you can add any discussions you'd like to have at the next meeting whenever you think of it, and that way you don't forget. Time for it. So I'll make sure to schedule that. I'll make it a recurring meeting. And is there anything else we need to cover before we go? Thanks to everyone for
something that might be interesting for folks to bring to the next meeting is like, are there requests or specific pain points people are having? Because I feel like we've talked a lot from, and sorry if I've like hijacked the meeting too much, but like we've talked a lot from the implementation perspective. But if folks are kind of struggling with something, or they wish a library did X, or yeah, it'd be great to hear from people who are like, missing some functionality in the existing libraries, or struggling with something, and how we can actually help as a working group.
Yeah, I think that's a good perspective to come at it from. So I have this Drive folder that I have that the meeting notes live in. And I've created another doc there just called Roadmaps, which doesn't have any contents in it right now. But if anyone wants to just toss yeah, I think use cases is a really good way to approach it, actually. Like if there are things that you want to have supported that are not supported right now, that's a great way to inform a roadmap rather than talking about sort of features from an implementation perspective. I think it's way more useful to think like, what do we want it to do? And then we can figure out what features are needed to support that. And that can, inform future conversations. Like maybe what value that we get out of here is breaking down those use cases into, okay, we implement it given the collective experience or expertise in the room.
Yeah, solving pain points, I think, would get us, through work and through solutions, rather than trying to think of an overarching roadmap or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think if we just get everyone to throw in their important things here, maybe we can then gather thumbs up on them and figure out what's most important based on that.
Well, I got problems.
Yeah, we all got problems. Okay, yeah. Thanks, everyone. Really good meeting, great conversation, and I will see you all again in 2 weeks.
Sounds good. Bye, everybody.
See you.
Bye.
Goodbye.